Tonight, we explore the rise and disappearance of a secret society born in the heart of Enlightenment Europe, a group so quiet, so controlled, that its destruction left behind more silence than answers. In the late 18th century, as reason challenged tradition and faith guarded power, a small circle of thinkers emerged in Bavaria, believing knowledge could reform the world. They did not march. They did not revolt. They did not preach in public. They met in whispers, used symbols, and trusted secrecy more than force. And for that alone, they became dangerous. They were called the Bavarian Illuminati. Not the myth you have heard, but the real order that collided with church authority, state fear, and an invisible line no one was meant to cross. Rome never issued a thunderous decree. There was no single public condemnation. Instead, there was silence. A silence that allowed bans, raids, exile, and erasure to unfold quietly, until the group vanished and only rumors remained. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because this story is not about who controlled the world, but about how fear, secrecy, and silence can rewrite history itself. Picture Bavaria in the late 18th century, not as a fairy tale kingdom, but as a quiet battlefield for the mind. Across Europe, the Enlightenment was spreading. Reason, science, and bold arguments about rights and power. Yet, in Bavaria, the state and the Catholic Church were still tightly woven together, and the safest thoughts were the ones spoken softly. If truth needs permission, where do questions go when the door is locked? Bavaria sat inside the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by princes who balanced tradition with pressure to modernize. Government posts, university chairs, and printing permissions depended on approval from officials who cared deeply about social order. The church shaped daily life through schools, sermons, and rules about marriage and morals. If you wanted to rise in law, teaching, or administration, you passed through institutions that expected loyalty to Catholic structure and to the rulers who defended it. The Enlightenment was not only about inventions, it was also a struggle over who gets to define truth. In many Catholic territories, bishops and state censors could limit what was printed, imported, or publicly discussed. The Index of Forbidden Books existed, and local censorship systems could treat certain authors as a threat to faith and stability. So while some European cities celebrated salons and open debate, other places treated unapproved ideas like sparks that could ignite panic. One of the most important stages for this clash was the University of Ingolstadt, a respected Bavarian school where theology and law trained future officials. For much of the 18th century, Jesuits held major influence there, and their approach emphasized disciplined learning tied closely to church teaching. That influence did not vanish overnight even after Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Society of Jesus in 1773. Professors stayed, habits stayed, and students learned which questions opened doors and which questions closed careers. politics also shifted. In 1777, Karl Theodor inherited Bavaria and became elector, bringing new administrative goals and new tensions to Munich. Like other rulers of his era, he faced calls for reform, better schools, and stronger government, but also fears of unrest and secret plotting. A ruler might allow some modern ideas, yet still tighten control when he sensed a hidden challenge to the alliance between throne and altar. That is why secrecy mattered. When public speech feels supervised, private networks can look like the only safe room left. In Munich and Ingolstadt, letters could be opened, meetings reported, and reputations ruined overnight, quietly by informers. People whispered that some books were safer hidden than read, and when knowledge is guarded, curiosity learns to wear a mask. Those who wanted reform or simply honest discussion could be tempted to meet quietly, trade letters, and build circles of trust, not because they were planning a war, but because they believed the rules of the day made certain conversations impossible. In a place where faith and state stood shoulder to shoulder, a hidden brotherhood could feel necessary, and to authorities intolerable. Adam Weishaupt did not look like a revolutionary, and that was the point. Born in 1748 in Ingolstadt, he was trained inside the very Catholic system he would later question. Orphaned young, he was educated by Jesuits and absorbed their discipline, methods of study, and respect for structured authority. By his early 30s, he became a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt, a position that placed him directly inside the machinery of church-approved knowledge. He knew how power worked because he lived inside it. Weishaupt was deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers who argued that reason, education, and moral improvement could reshape society. He read works that emphasized natural law, personal conscience, and freedom from superstition. Yet, he also understood the limits of public debate in Bavaria. Professors were watched. Publications required approval. A careless sentence could end a career. In that environment, open calls for reform were not brave gestures. They were suicide. What disturbed Weishaupt most was not religion itself, but what he saw as the misuse of religious authority to control thought. He believed that fear and ignorance were tools used to maintain obedience. In his view, people were not naturally corrupt, but deliberately kept uninformed. Education, if freed from dogma, could create moral citizens capable of self-rule. This belief put him at odds with a system that relied on obedience over inquiry. By the 1770s, the suppression of the Jesuit order by Pope Clement XIV had changed the academic landscape, but not as much as outsiders believed. Jesuit influence remained strong, especially in teaching methods and loyalty networks. Weishaupt found himself isolated, a non-Jesuit professor surrounded by colleagues shaped by the old order. Advancement was limited, trust was thin, surveillance was constant. It was within this pressure that his central idea formed. Reform could not succeed through pamphlets or speeches alone. Any movement for change would be shut down before it began. If ideas were to survive, they needed protection. If education was to spread, it needed structure. Weishaupt concluded that an organization operating quietly, bound by trust, and hidden from immediate scrutiny was not a threat to society, but a necessity within it. This was not a call for chaos. His vision was disciplined and gradual. Members would educate themselves, then others, slowly weakening what he saw as the grip of superstition. Authority would be challenged, not through violence, but through reason passed hand to hand. The organization would mirror the structures of power it opposed: secrecy, ranks, loyalty, but use them for moral improvement instead of control. In a land where the church watched speech and the state feared unrest, Weishaupt's revolt did not raise a banner. It lowered its voice. His answer to censorship was silence. His response to surveillance was invisibility. And in that quiet decision, the foundation was laid for something authorities would later fear far more than open protest: a hidden network built to survive in the shadows of Enlightenment Bavaria. May 1st, 1776 did not arrive with fanfare in Bavaria. There were no public declarations, no pamphlets nailed to doors, no crowds gathering in the streets. Yet, on that quiet day, inside a world already tense with suspicion, Adam Weishaupt took a step that would echo far beyond its modest beginning. He formed a small circle that he believed could protect ideas long enough for them to grow. It was not meant to shock the public. It was meant to survive it. Weishaupt called his early group the Perfectibilists, a name chosen carefully to reflect moral improvement rather than rebellion. The purpose was simple in theory and dangerous in practice. Members would work to improve themselves through study, discipline, and reason, and then quietly influence society through education and example. This was not a club for idle debate. It was designed as a method, controlled, deliberate, and hidden. The decision to operate in secrecy was not dramatic. It was practical. Bavaria was a place where unofficial gatherings could be reported and questioned. Letters could be intercepted. Careers could vanish overnight. A public reform society would not last a year. So the new order adopted rules that limited knowledge, even among its own members. Each person knew only what they needed to know. Trust was earned slowly. At first, the group was tiny. Weishaupt and a handful of students met discreetly, often under the cover of ordinary social interactions. There were no grand halls or public rituals. Early meetings focused on reading, discussion, and the careful sharing of approved ideas. Members took symbolic names to protect their identities and to reinforce the sense that the individual mattered less than the mission. The date itself carried meaning. May 1st was associated with renewal and beginnings, but also passed quietly enough to avoid notice. While across the Atlantic, the American colonies were moving toward open revolution, Bavaria remained tightly controlled. Weishaupt was not inspired by rebellion through force. He believed lasting change came from shaping minds before challenging institutions. This early version of the Illuminati had no armies, no weapons, and no clear political program. Its strength was meant to lie in patience. Members were encouraged to pursue careers in law, teaching, medicine, and administration. Influence would come later, not through commands, but through presence. The organization would grow like roots beneath the surface, unseen but steady. What made the founding moment unusual was not its size, but its design. Weishaupt intentionally mirrored the structures of the institutions he knew best. Ranks, rules, loyalty, and secrecy were tools he had observed in both church and state. He believed that power could not be challenged by disorder, only by a better organized alternative. On that quiet day in 1776, no authority reacted because no authority noticed. That was the success. The Bavarian Illuminati did not begin as a threat. It began as an answer to silence, a controlled experiment in whether ideas could be protected from censorship by being hidden. The earliest identity of the Illuminati was not built around overthrow or chaos, but around the idea of improvement. Weishaupt believed society could only change if individuals changed first. For that reason, the order called its members perfectibilists, a word meant to suggest progress toward moral and intellectual refinement, rather than instant perfection. This language mattered. In a land where rebellion invited punishment, self-improvement sounded harmless, even respectable. At the center of this identity was education. Members were encouraged to read widely, think critically, and question superstition while still appearing outwardly obedient. The goal was not to shock the public, but to slowly reshape thinking from within accepted social roles. A teacher, a lawyer, or a civil servant who quietly valued reason could influence far more than a loud critic who was quickly silenced. Structure was essential. The order developed internal ranks that controlled how much information a member received. Advancement was slow and based on trust, loyalty, and demonstrated discipline. New members learned only basic principles, while higher ranks gained deeper insight into the organization's goals. This system reduced risk. If one member was exposed, they could not betray what they did not know. Secrecy was not a dramatic gesture, it was a defensive one. Symbols also played a role. The Illuminati adopted imagery drawn from classical philosophy and Enlightenment thought. One of the most important was the owl of Minerva, a symbol associated with wisdom that comes at dusk, when events are already unfolding. To Weishaupt, this represented understanding gained through reflection rather than blind faith. The owl was not a call to revolt. It was a quiet statement that true knowledge often arrives late and must be guarded carefully. the use of symbols served another purpose. In an age when words could be dangerous, images allowed ideas to pass quietly. A symbol could unite members without attracting attention from outsiders. To authorities, it looked like decoration. To insiders, it carried meaning about reason, learning, and restraint. Unlike later myths, early Illuminati rituals were modest. There were no dark ceremonies or violent oaths. Meetings focused on discussion, moral exercises, and the careful exchange of approved texts. Members were taught to control their emotions, avoid reckless speech, and blend into society. The order valued patience above passion. This identity separated the Illuminati from revolutionary movements that relied on public anger. Weishaupt did not trust crowds. He trusted education. He believed lasting reform could not be forced, only cultivated. The order was designed to outlast censorship by avoiding attention altogether. In this early phase, the Illuminati looked less like a conspiracy and more like a disciplined school hidden inside society. Its symbols spoke of wisdom, its ranks enforced caution, and its purpose was framed as personal growth. Yet, to a state built on obedience and religious authority, even quiet self-improvement outside approved structures carried danger. What appeared inward-looking would later be judged as subversive, not because it preached violence, but because it encouraged thinking beyond permission itself. The Illuminati did not grow through passion or excitement. It grew through structure. Weishaupt understood that any group challenging accepted authority could not survive chaos. So, he built the order like a ladder, one rung at a time, where each step upward revealed only what was necessary. This was not secrecy for mystery, but secrecy for survival. Recruitment was careful and selective. Members were not gathered from the streets or drawn in by bold promises. They were observed first. Character mattered more than enthusiasm. Curiosity without discipline was dangerous. A potential recruit was evaluated for loyalty, discretion, and patience before being invited any further. The order preferred people who could keep quiet, not those who wanted attention. Once admitted, a new member entered at the lowest level. At this stage, they were not told about the full scope of the organization. They were introduced to basic ideas about moral improvement, education, and self-control. The purpose was to test behavior over time. Advancement depended not on how much someone spoke, but on how well they listened and followed rules. As members moved upward, they gained access to deeper layers of knowledge. Each degree came with new responsibilities and greater trust, but also greater restraint. No one was allowed to see the entire structure at once. This compartmentalized design meant that even if one member was questioned or exposed, the rest of the order remained protected. Information was divided deliberately, like sealed rooms inside a larger house. Coded names played an important role. Members adopted symbolic identities often drawn from classical history or philosophy. This served two purposes. It protected real identities in written correspondence, and it reinforced the idea that the individual ego was secondary to the mission. A name could be replaced. The structure could not. Communication was controlled. Letters were written cautiously. Language was measured, and sensitive ideas were often implied rather than stated directly. Members were taught how to speak in ways that sounded harmless to outsiders while carrying meaning for those who knew how to listen. This was a skill developed slowly, shaped by living under censorship. The ladder system also created loyalty. Each level felt earned. Advancement became proof of trust, not power. Members who rose slowly were less likely to betray what they had worked hard to gain. The order relied on psychology as much as philosophy. People protect what they invest in. This design mirrored the institutions Weishaupt knew well. The church had ranks. The state had hierarchies. Authority flowed downward, not outward. Weishaupt believed that to resist these systems, one had to understand and replicate their strengths while removing what he saw as their abuses. To outsiders, if they noticed anything at all, the Illuminati appeared fragmented and small. That was intentional. No single member could describe the whole organization because no single member knew it. The ladder did not reveal the entire building, only the next step. And in a world where surveillance thrived on complete pictures, an incomplete one was the safest place to stand. The Illuminati faced a simple problem once their structure was set. Ideas hidden too well do not travel far. Bavaria was small, and Weishaupt understood that if the order stayed isolated, it would wither before it mattered. To grow without exposing itself, the Illuminati looked for an existing network that already understood secrecy, symbols, and mutual trust. That network was Freemasonry. By the 1770s, Masonic lodges were spread across German lands and beyond. They attracted educated men, officials, and professionals who valued fraternity and discussion. Many lodges spoke the language of Enlightenment ideals, reason, tolerance, and moral improvement. To Weishaupt, this was not an enemy space. It was fertile ground. The Illuminati did not publicly challenge Freemasonry. Instead, they moved quietly inside it. Members of the order were encouraged to join Masonic lodges and build relationships. In many cases, recruits were first encountered through these lodges, where secrecy was already normalized and meetings did not automatically raise suspicion. This allowed the Illuminati to expand faster than they could on their own. Yet the relationship was never equal. Weishaupt believed Freemasonry lacked direction. He saw lodges as socially useful but philosophically shallow, rich in ritual but poor in purpose. His goal was not to serve Masonry, but to guide it. Illuminati members were instructed to subtly influence discussions, introduce structured ideas, and recruit promising Masons into the higher discipline of the order. This strategy was effective but risky. It created overlap between organizations, blurring boundaries. Some Masons welcomed the added intellectual rigor. Others grew suspicious of outside influence. Differences in belief began to surface. While many Masonic lodges valued tradition and symbolism, the Illuminati pushed for rational reform and internal discipline. The bridge between the two groups expanded quickly after Adolf von Knigge joined the Illuminati in 1780. Knigge was already deeply involved in Masonry and understood its networks. He helped adapt Illuminati structure to fit Masonic environments, making recruitment smoother and less visible. Under his influence, the order spread into multiple German states within a few years. From the outside, this expansion looked confusing. Authorities struggled to separate Masons from Illuminati, and rumors merged the two into a single hidden force. This confusion would later be used against both groups, but at the time, the overlap provided cover. A meeting could be explained as Masonic. A letter could be dismissed as lodge business. The Vatican and Catholic authorities already viewed Freemasonry with suspicion, associating secret oaths with spiritual danger. By attaching itself to Masonic networks, the Illuminati inherited that suspicion and deeper scrutiny from clerical observers across Bavaria and neighboring territories. Still, the Freemasonry bridge served its purpose. It allowed a small Bavarian order to step beyond local limits without revealing its core. The Illuminati moved not by shouting, but by blending in, using an existing shadow to deepen their own. And in doing so, they stepped closer to visibility, even as they tried to remain unseen. This balance defined their expansion strategy during these critical formative years. When Adolf von Knigge entered the picture, the Illuminati stopped being a small academic experiment and began to resemble a serious network. Knigge was born into nobility in 1752 and moved comfortably among courts, lodges, and intellectual circles. Unlike Weishaupt, he was not rooted in one university or city. He traveled, negotiated, and understood how influence moved through society and elite social structures with remarkable ease and confidence over time. Knigge encountered the Illuminati through Masonic connections and quickly recognized both its potential and its weaknesses. He admired Weishaupt's goals, but saw that the order lacked polish, unity, and a clear system that outsiders could accept. Where Weishaupt was cautious and inward, Knigge was expansive and strategic. Their partnership would reshape the organization in lasting ways that neither could achieve alone. One of Knigge's first contributions was organizational clarity. He helped refine degrees, rituals, and language so the order could function smoothly across regions. The Illuminati began to look less like a circle of students and more like a disciplined fraternity that educated men could join without suspicion. This made recruitment easier and faster across many cities and courts of influence. Knigge also understood psychology. He knew that people wanted purpose, recognition, and progression. Under his influence, the order improved how it rewarded loyalty and advancement. Members felt part of something larger than themselves, something structured and meaningful. This emotional commitment strengthened secrecy and reduced internal conflict and doubt over time. Expansion followed quickly. Through Knigge's contacts, the Illuminati spread beyond Ingolstadt into Munich, Frankfurt, and other German states. Membership grew to include officials, writers, and nobles. For the first time, the order had reach beyond the classroom. What had been theoretical now brushed against real administration and social power across regions and governments. This rapid growth changed perception. Authorities, who had ignored the Illuminati as harmless, began hearing rumors of influence in courts and offices. The order's success became its danger. What was once invisible now cast a shadow that invited attention and fear from rulers and clergy watching closely. The partnership between Weishaupt and Nigger was not without tension. Weishaupt worried that expansion invited exposure. Knigger believed stagnation invited failure. Both views shaped decisions as the order grew faster than its founders first imagined possible. By the early 1780s, the Illuminati had reached their peak. They were no longer a local secret, but a whispered presence across German lands. Letters circulated quietly, names were guessed. Suspicion grew steadily among rulers and clergy alike. Knigger's arrival marked the moment when the Illuminati crossed an invisible line. They moved from surviving in secrecy to shaping conversations quietly at scale. That transformation defined their legacy and ensured that when authorities finally looked closely, they would not see a harmless club, but a network already too large to ignore, and already deeply rooted in society and power structures everywhere, permanently and silently across regions and institutions and offices alike, forevermore. This shift would soon provoke reactions from threatened authorities. The Illuminati insisted they were not enemies of society, but its correction. In their own writings, letters, and internal instructions, they described their purpose as moral reform through reason. They believed superstition kept people fearful and obedient, and that fear was the easiest tool for abuse of power. Their goal, as stated, was to replace blind belief with understanding. At the center of their concern was the relationship between religion and authority. Bavaria was deeply Catholic, and the Church did not merely guide faith, it shaped education, law, and public behavior. The Illuminati argued that when religious institutions controlled every layer of life, questioning became dangerous and progress slowed. They claimed this dominance harmed both truth and society. The order did not openly call for the destruction of religion. That would have been suicidal. Instead, they spoke of separating belief from control. Faith, they argued, should be personal and voluntary, not enforced through fear or law. Public life, they believed, should be guided by reason, ethics, and evidence rather than doctrine. Another stated aim was opposition to tyranny in all forms. This included not only kings and princes, but systems that rewarded obedience over thought. The Illuminati believed many rulers depended on ignorance to maintain power. An educated population, in their view, would demand accountability rather than submission. They also spoke against corruption. Court favoritism, inherited privilege, and unearned authority were seen as obstacles to fairness. The order promoted merit over birth, believing positions of influence should be earned through ability and knowledge. This idea alone placed them at odds with aristocratic and clerical elites. Education was the tool they trusted most. They encouraged the spread of literacy, critical thinking, and scientific curiosity. Members were taught that changing laws meant little if minds remained controlled. True reform, they claimed, required patient cultivation of understanding across generations. The Illuminati also rejected superstition as a political weapon. Miracles, relics, and fear of punishment were often used to silence doubt. They believed such tactics kept people dependent on authority figures who claimed exclusive access to truth. By questioning superstition, they challenged the power built upon it. To supporters, these aims sounded noble and restrained. To authorities, they sounded dangerous. A society encouraged to think freely was harder to govern. A church questioned in public life risked losing influence. Even without violence, the ideas themselves threatened established order. What the Illuminati claimed to want was not chaos, but reform. They argued they were protecting society from abuse by promoting reason over fear. Yet, in a world where authority relied on tradition and obedience, even peaceful ideas could be treated as rebellion, and that tension would soon define their fate. Bavaria in the late 18th century was not a neutral ground for quiet reform. It was a place where political authority and Catholic legitimacy were deeply intertwined. The ruler was not only a secular leader, but a defender of the faith. And the church was not only spiritual, but administrative. In such a system, loyalty to the state and loyalty to Catholic doctrine reinforced each other. Any movement that questioned one appeared to threaten both. The electorate of Bavaria relied on the church to educate its citizens, justify its laws, and maintain social order. Universities were overseen by clergy. Moral teaching was inseparable from obedience. To question religious authority was to weaken the structure that held governance together. That made independent thought suspicious by default. Secrecy made things worse. In Bavaria, open debate could sometimes be tolerated within limits, but hidden organizations triggered fear. A group that met privately, used coded language, and recruited selectively looked less like philosophy and more like conspiracy. Even if no laws were broken, the method itself appeared hostile. The state had long experience with dissent. Memories of religious conflict and rebellion lingered. Authorities believed that unrest began not with armies, but with ideas spreading quietly. That belief shaped policy. Surveillance was common. Informants were rewarded. Anything that escaped official oversight was treated as a potential threat. The Illuminati believed discretion would protect them. In Bavaria, discretion attracted attention. Officials were trained to look for what was not visible. When rumors of secret societies reached courts and church offices, they were not dismissed as harmless. They were investigated. Catholic leaders were particularly alarmed. The church viewed itself as the guardian of truth and moral order, a group that encouraged private interpretation, Rational critique and separation of faith from authority challenged that role directly. Even without attacking doctrine, the Illuminati undermined the idea that truth flowed only through approved channels. This created a dangerous perception. The Illuminati were not seen as thinkers seeking reform, but as subversives attempting to bypass legitimate authority. Their secrecy suggested guilt. Their structure suggested ambition. Their criticism of superstition sounded like an attack on faith itself. In another land, these ideas might have sparked debate. In Bavaria, they triggered defense. The state did not distinguish easily between philosophical challenge and political danger. A secret society promoting reform appeared indistinguishable from one plotting overthrow. This is why Bavaria was the worst place to be invisible. Silence was not safety, it was evidence. The more the Illuminati tried to avoid notice, the more they seemed to confirm suspicion. And in a system where church and state leaned on each other for survival, even quiet questioning could be treated as an act of disloyalty. Rumors do not need proof to become powerful. In late 18th century Bavaria, suggestion alone could shift policy and destroy reputations. As the Illuminati expanded quietly, whispers began to move faster than facts. People spoke of members in courts, in universities, in government offices. Whether true or exaggerated, these claims changed how the order was seen by those in power. The idea that a secret group might influence decisions behind the scenes was deeply unsettling to rulers. Authority depended on visible hierarchy and loyalty. If unseen networks existed, then control was no longer complete. Even a small organization could appear vast once imagination filled in the gaps left by secrecy. The Illuminati had never claimed to rule, yet rumors suggested they were everywhere. A judge, rumored to be a member. A professor suspected of spreading ideas. A clerk accused of quiet allegiance. Each rumor reinforced the next. Soon, the order seemed larger and more dangerous than it actually was. Political rivals learned to use these whispers as weapons. Accusing an opponent of secret loyalty was easier than proving corruption. Suggesting Illuminati influence could discredit officials without evidence. In a climate of fear, denial sounded like guilt. The Church amplified these concerns. Sermons warned against hidden enemies of faith. Pamphlets hinted at plots without naming sources. Fear spread through implication rather than accusation. This allowed alarm to grow without accountability. The order's secrecy now worked against it. Codes and aliases that once protected members were reinterpreted as proof of deception. Layered ranks suggested hidden command. Private correspondence looked like planning. Even philosophical discussions were framed as signals. Authorities did not need to know the truth. They needed justification. Rumors provided that. Once officials believed influence had reached offices and courts, the question shifted from what the Illuminati were doing to what they might do next. Possibility became danger. investigations followed whispers, not evidence. Informants were encouraged. Personal grudges found new purpose. A neighbour's suspicion could become an official report. The line between fact and fear disappeared. By the early 1780s, the Illuminati were no longer judged by their writings, but by their reputation. That reputation was shaped almost entirely by rumour. Size was exaggerated, intent was assumed, influence was imagined. This is how secrecy becomes conspiracy, not through action, but through perception. The order's actual reach mattered less than what people believed. Once belief turned against them, the Illuminati lost control of their own image. And in politics, image often matters more than reality. Long before the Illuminati appeared, the Vatican had already defined how it viewed secrecy. Since the early 18th century, Rome had condemned secret societies as threats to spiritual authority and social order, not because of specific crimes, but because secrecy itself challenged obedience and transparency demanded by the Church historically. It did not need new arguments when new groups emerged. Papal bulls against Freemasonry already warned that hidden oaths weakened faith, loyalty, and moral clarity, teaching believers to answer to unknown masters rather than the Church, the state, or God as publicly understood within Catholic teaching and law tradition firmly. These condemnations shaped how all secret organizations were perceived across Catholic Europe. Any group that met privately, used symbols, or required vows automatically inherited suspicion regardless of intent. The Illuminati did not exist in isolation, but entered a landscape already hostile to secrecy, reform, and unauthorized thought within society broadly. Rome's concern was not limited to politics. The Church viewed secret oaths as spiritually dangerous because they competed with religious vows. Swearing loyalty in darkness suggested divided conscience. A Christian, the Church taught, should owe ultimate allegiance openly and without intermediaries beyond God, doctrine, authority, and approved ecclesiastical structures alone. Because the Illuminati intersected with Masonic networks, they inherited this condemnation by association. Even without a direct papal decree naming them, officials understood the message. Secrecy equaled danger. Reform conducted quietly equaled rebellion. The Vatican did not need to speak loudly when existing doctrine already framed judgment and response clearly. This silence was powerful. By saying nothing specific about the Illuminati, Rome allowed local rulers and bishops to act freely. They could apply existing bans, sermons, and suspicions without awaiting instruction. Condemnation existed in principle, ready to be used when convenient against any group fitting the forbidden secretive pattern described. For Bavarian authorities, this context mattered deeply. Acting against the Illuminati did not appear radical or unjust. It appeared obedient. Suppressing secret reformers aligned the state with Catholic tradition, reinforcing legitimacy. To ignore such groups risked appearing weak or spiritually negligent before Rome, clergy, and the faithful population watching closely. The Vatican's long shadow meant definitions were already set. Secret society meant moral threat. Hidden hierarchy meant disobedience. Private reform meant pride. These assumptions shaped every investigation. The Illuminati were judged not on actions alone, but on categories pre-written by doctrine long before evidence, trials, or confessions were ever considered. In this way, condemnation functioned without declaration. Rome remained silent, yet its position was understood. The framework existed, waiting. When fear rose and rumors spread, authorities did not ask whether to act. They only decided how far to go using existing theology, law, precedent, and institutional authority as justification always. The Vatican did not need to invent a response to the Illuminati. It had prepared one long before their birth. In that silence, the order was already condemned, not for what it proved, but for what secrecy itself was believed to represent within Catholic imagination, memory, fear, and authority structures. The Vatican never issued a dramatic proclamation naming the Bavarian Illuminati as a singular enemy of the Church. There was no public decree, no thunderous warning, no formal announcement sent across Europe. Yet, this absence of sound did not mean absence of judgment. Silence itself functioned as permission. The Church had already defined secret societies as spiritually dangerous, and that existing framework quietly settled over the Illuminati without resistance or debate. Rome understood that naming a group gave it shape and attention. Attention invited curiosity. Curiosity invited sympathy. By avoiding direct focus, the Church allowed the Illuminati to be handled at the local level, framed as just another example of forbidden secrecy rather than a movement worthy of global notice. This strategy limited legitimacy while preserving authority. Local bishops and clergy did not need instructions. They already knew how to act. Papal condemnations of Freemasonry had established the language. Secret oaths weakened faith. Hidden hierarchies divided loyalty. Unapproved assemblies threatened obedience. The Illuminati fit every warning without ever being named directly. This gave local rulers moral cover. Bavarian officials could move against the order while claiming religious responsibility rather than political fear. Clergy could warn congregations without issuing new doctrine. Suppression appeared preventative and righteous, not reactive or panicked. Authority looked calm while opposition looked dangerous. Silence also avoided martyrdom. Open condemnation can elevate an enemy by making it visible. Quiet pressure dissolves influence without spectacle. The Church had learned through centuries that ideas do not always need to be destroyed publicly. Sometimes they only need to be isolated until they disappear from view. For the Illuminati, this was devastating. They could not defend themselves against an accusation that was never formally made. There was no trial to answer, no charge to refute. Instead, suspicion surrounded them slowly. Each search, each arrest, each ban felt justified by an unspoken agreement. The phrase "dangerous to faith" required no explanation. In Catholic lands, that label alone could end careers and friendships. Once applied, it spread through whispers and official language alike. Guilt became assumed rather than proven. Rome's silence also protected Rome. If the Illuminati collapsed, the Church appeared consistent. If they survived, the Vatican had not legitimized them by opposition. Either outcome preserved authority. By the time the order was dismantled, condemnation felt inevitable, not because evidence demanded it, but because the moral ground had already been prepared. The Illuminati were condemned not by decree, but by atmosphere. In that atmosphere, silence spoke louder than any words. Karl Theodor did not act suddenly or blindly. His response grew from a climate already thick with suspicion, pressure from clergy, and anxiety about losing control over ideas. As Elector of Bavaria, he ruled a land where order depended on obedience, and obedience depended on clear lines of authority. Secret societies blurred those lines in ways that made governance feel fragile. By the early 1780s, rumors about hidden networks had reached the highest levels of administration. Reports suggested that unauthorized groups met regularly, exchanged coded letters, and recruited men in sensitive positions. Even without proof of criminal acts, the very existence of such networks appeared incompatible with stability. Karl Theodor viewed himself as a protector of public morality and religious harmony. He relied heavily on Catholic legitimacy to support his rule. Allowing secret societies to operate unchecked risked appearing weak before both Rome and his own clergy. In a system built on visible loyalty, invisible alliances could not be tolerated. The first step was broad and careful. Rather than naming a single group, the government issued decrees against all unauthorized associations. These laws did not target ideology directly. They targeted structure. Any group meeting privately without state approval was now illegal. This approach avoided debate and framed suppression as administrative necessity rather than ideological repression. These edicts were issued in the year 1784 and expanded in 1785. They banned secret meetings, oaths, and societies not explicitly sanctioned by the state. The language was firm but neutral. Order and morality were the stated goals. Public safety was the justification. In reality, the laws were designed to flush out groups like the Illuminati. Once secrecy itself was criminalized, investigation became easy. Officials could search homes, seize papers, and interrogate members without needing to prove treason or rebellion. The burden shifted entirely onto the accused. The Church supported these moves openly. Clergy preached obedience to lawful authority and warned against secret influences. The alignment between pulpit and court was complete. Religious concern and political action reinforced each other seamlessly. Karl Theodor also had personal reasons to act. He distrusted intellectual movements that challenged tradition. Enlightenment ideas appealed to reformers, but to rulers they threatened predictability. A society that questioned authority could eventually demand limits on power itself. By framing his actions as defense of order rather than fear of ideas, Karl Theodor avoided backlash. Many citizens accepted the laws as reasonable. Few were willing to defend secret societies publicly, especially under religious scrutiny. This moment marked a turning point. The state had drawn its line. What followed would not be philosophical debate, but enforcement. The stage was set for a direct strike on the Illuminati, not as thinkers, but as lawbreakers. And once law entered the picture, survival became nearly impossible. The years 1784 and 1785 marked the decisive turning point for the Bavarian Illuminati. What had once survived through discretion now faced the full force of state authority. The government no longer whispered. It acted openly, using law as the instrument of control and public order. The first edict issued in 1784 banned all unauthorized societies, regardless of purpose. Meetings held without approval were illegal. Oaths taken in secrecy were forbidden. This language did not mention the Illuminati by name, but everyone understood who stood in its shadow across Bavaria at the time period. A second decree followed in 1785, expanding enforcement and penalties. Authorities were empowered to search homes, seize documents, and question suspects. Membership itself became dangerous. To belong to a banned society was enough to lose position, income, and protection under the law within Bavarian jurisdiction at that moment. These laws shattered the order's structure. Recruitment stopped almost overnight. Meetings dissolved under fear of exposure. Communication networks collapsed as letters were intercepted and burned. Members who once felt secure now faced a choice between silence, confession, or flight. As pressure increased across cities, universities, courts, and administrative offices rapidly. Fear worked faster than police. Some members destroyed papers before officials arrived. Others informed on former allies to protect themselves. Trust vanished. The secrecy that once bound the Illuminati together now turned inward, accelerating collapse from within rather than attack from outside. By frightened participants across Bavaria entirely, then swiftly. The church reinforced the crackdown. Sermons warned of hidden enemies undermining faith. Confessors questioned loyalty. Moral language framed compliance as righteousness. Few dared resist when obedience was tied to salvation, reputation, and survival within Catholic society under Bavarian law and ecclesiastical authority combined tightly together at that time period fully. Officials framed their actions as preventative, not punitive. They claimed to defend morality and order. Yet, the result was unmistakable. the Illuminati could no longer exist as an organization. Its public life ended through regulation or rather than battle, using statutes, fear, compliance, and enforcement mechanisms alone without violence directly applied. By the end of 1785, the order was effectively dismantled in Bavaria. What remained were fragments, memories, and confiscated archives. The state had succeeded without spectacle, proving that law could silence ideas as effectively as force, when authority aligned with religious legitimacy and public fear together fully present. The crackdown sent a message beyond the Illuminati. Independent reform carried risk. Secrecy invited destruction. Enlightenment without permission would not be tolerated. Bavaria had drawn its boundary, and many quietly adjusted their ambitions to survive within the electorate's political, religious, and social systems then governing life, daily conduct, and belief. This moment closed one chapter of the order's existence, but opened another in legend. Suppression ensured silence, yet silence allowed imagination to grow. The Illuminati disappeared from meetings, but not from memory or suspicion, which would later transform. History, rumor, fear, myth, and speculation across Europe for centuries ahead, quietly. When Bavarian authorities moved from bans to raids, paper became the battlefield. Homes of suspected members were searched, desks were opened, drawers emptied, letters, codes, notes, and internal instructions were seized and gathered as proof. What had once been private discussion was now state evidence, interpreted through fear and suspicion, rather than context or intent. Among the documents were philosophical reflections, critiques of superstition, and discussions about reforming education and morality. To members, these were Enlightenment ideas. To authorities, they read as attacks on religion and tradition. Language that questioned clerical power was labeled anti-religious. Calls for reform were framed as threats to order. Officials did not need to find a plan for rebellion. They only needed material that could be interpreted as dangerous. In a system already convinced that secrecy equaled guilt, interpretation replaced proof. Ambiguous phrases were treated as admissions. Private speculation was treated as intent. Some letters discussed influence within institutions. These were not instructions for overthrow, but they sounded strategic. Authorities presented them as evidence of manipulation. Even ordinary administrative planning was described as infiltration. The absence of violent planning did not weaken the case. It strengthened the narrative that danger was subtle and hidden. The problem was not what the papers proved, but what they allowed people to imagine. When documents are removed from context, meaning shifts. Internal debates became official positions. Hypothetical discussions became goals. Disagreement became conspiracy. The Church reinforced these interpretations. Clergy emphasized passages that challenged doctrine, while ignoring others that spoke of morality and discipline. The message was simple. This was not philosophy. It was corruption of faith. Some seized. Materials were published selectively to justify repression. the public saw fragments without explanation. Fear filled the gaps. Few questioned the framing, because few wished to be associated with the accused. In the end, the papers solved a political problem. They provided justification without requiring proof of a coup. The Illuminati were condemned not for what they planned, but for what authorities said their words implied. In a climate of fear, implication was enough. When the Bavarian state decided to publish what it had seized, the struggle moved from courtrooms into the public mind. Officials understood that secrecy protected the Illuminati, but exposure would destroy them. By printing selected documents, the government turned private language into public spectacle and reframed internal discipline as evidence of danger. These publications appeared in the mid-1780s and were presented as warnings to the public. Ritual phrases, code names, and internal instructions were stripped of context and displayed as proof of deception. What had once been symbolic or philosophical now looked theatrical and suspicious. To ordinary readers unfamiliar with Enlightenment societies, the state did not publish everything. It chose fragments that confirmed fear. Passages criticizing superstition were printed without explanation. Discussions of influence were framed as plots. The absence of violent intent did not matter. The documents were arranged to suggest a hidden hand working against faith and authority. For the public, this was shocking. Most people had never seen the inner language of a secret society. Words meant for trusted members now appeared strange and unsettling. Oaths sounded ominous. Pseudonyms sounded criminal. Privacy itself looked like guilt. Clergy amplified the reaction. Sermons referenced the publications as proof that secret groups endangered souls. The message was clear. What hid from the church hid from truth. Fear replaced curiosity almost overnight. For members still undecided, this was the breaking point. Association now meant public shame. Employers questioned loyalty. Families pressured withdrawal. Even silence felt dangerous. The possibility of rebuilding quietly vanished. The publications also protected the state. By making documents public, officials framed repression as transparency. They were not hiding actions. They were revealing danger. Any defense by the accused sounded like excuse or denial. What mattered was not accuracy, but effect. Once secrets were public, trust collapsed. Networks rely on confidence. That confidence could not survive ridicule and fear. The Illuminati could no longer exist as a hidden society once their language belonged to everyone. Exposure achieved what arrests alone could not. It erased mystery while magnifying threat. From that moment, survival was impossible. Not because ideas died, but because secrecy did. And without secrecy, the order had no structure left to stand upon. As pressure mounted across Bavaria, Adam Weishaupt became the most visible target. He was no longer just a professor with controversial ideas. He was now portrayed as the architect of a forbidden network. Authorities did not need to arrest him immediately. Stripping him of position and protection was enough to begin his fall. Weishaupt lost his post at the University of Ingolstadt in the year 1784. This was more than a professional setback. It removed his income, status, and legal shield. Without an official role, he became vulnerable to further action. Surveillance increased. Associates withdrew. Silence surrounded him. The loss sent a clear message. Intellectual dissent would not be tolerated when paired with secrecy. Weishaupt was isolated before he was punished. Friends distanced themselves to protect careers. Students disappeared. The order he founded could no longer protect its creator. Facing possible arrest, Weishaupt fled Bavaria. He escaped quietly, moving beyond the reach of local authorities. Eventually, he found refuge in Gotha under the protection of Duke Ernst II, a ruler sympathetic to Enlightenment thinkers. Exile saved his freedom but ended his influence. From outside Bavaria, Weishaupt attempted to defend himself through writing. He published works denying revolutionary intent and explaining the order's philosophy. These texts argued for reason, morality, and reform, but distance weakened their effect. His words no longer shaped events on the ground. Inside Bavaria, his absence was devastating. Leadership fractured. Without its founder, the Illuminati lacked direction. Communication collapsed. Remaining members disagreed over strategy and survival. Some fled. Others surrendered documents. Many simply disappeared back into ordinary life. Weishaupt's fall also shifted narrative. Authorities framed his flight as admission of guilt. Escape looked like confession. Few questioned whether fear drove his decision. In public, imagination, innocence does not run. That assumption hardened quickly. The Church interpreted events as moral victory. The state framed them as restoration of order. No trial was needed. The outcome spoke for itself. The leader was gone. The society was silent. Weishaupt lived the rest of his life writing and reflecting, never regaining his former influence. His ideas survived on paper, but the organization did not. When he fled, the Illuminati ceased to be a movement and became a memory, shaped by its enemies more than its founder. By the month of March 1785, the outcome was no longer in doubt. What had begun as regulation and investigation hardened into finality. Within Bavaria, it was widely understood that the Illuminati no longer functioned as an organization. The state had not merely disrupted it. It had ended it through decree and pressure combined. The government did not announce a ceremonial conclusion. There was no declaration of victory. Instead, enforcement made continuation impossible. Meetings were illegal. Membership was dangerous. Communication risked punishment. Without the ability to gather, recruit, or correspond, the structure collapsed under its own weight. The final decrees clarified intent. They confirmed that secret societies were incompatible with Bavarian order. No exemptions were offered. No appeals invited. The language left no space for reinterpretation. Survival required invisibility, and invisibility now guaranteed suspicion rather than safety. Officials understood that organizations do not need to be destroyed physically to die. They only need to be denied oxygen. In this case, oxygen was legality, trust, and discretion. Once removed, the Illuminati could not breathe. Former members read the message clearly. Continued association risked arrest, loss of position, and public disgrace. Many burned papers. Others fled. Some confessed to protect families. Loyalty dissolved quickly when survival was at stake. The Church interpreted the outcome as restoration. Sermons praised order and obedience. Silence returned to pulpits where fear had grown. The faithful were reassured that hidden threats had been addressed. For the state, this was proof that law could suppress ideas without rebellion. No riots followed, no martyrs were created. Control appeared calm and justified. That appearance mattered more than debate. Outside Bavaria, observers noticed the speed of collapse. Enlightenment societies across Europe took warning. Reform could exist, but secrecy carried risk. Authority had drawn a boundary and enforced it successfully. By spring, the Illuminati existed only as confiscated documents and whispered memory. There were no councils, no rituals, no hierarchy left to dismantle. The organization was finished in practice, even if its name survived in rumor. The death blow was not dramatic. It was administrative. And because it came through decree rather than violence, it appeared lawful, moral, and final. The Illuminati had not been defeated in battle. They had been erased by authority. When people speak of the Vatican in this story, they often imagine a single voice issuing commands from Rome. That image is misleading. In the late 18th century, the Church functioned less like a centralized speaker and more like a network of influence. Power moved through bishops, courts, universities, and confessionals. Condemnation rarely required announcement. It traveled through atmosphere. Rome had already defined its boundaries. Secret societies were dangerous. Private oaths divided loyalty. Enlightenment ideas that challenged doctrine weakened authority. These positions did not need to be restated for every new group. Local clergy understood how to apply them. Silence from Rome did not mean neutrality. It meant permission to act within an established framework. In Bavaria, bishops worked closely with state officials. Church courts reinforced moral language that framed obedience as virtue and secrecy as sin. Confessors questioned allegiances quietly. Sermons warned generally without naming targets. This created pressure without spectacle. The Vatican's influence was strongest where it appeared least direct. By avoiding specific condemnation of Weishaupt, the Church avoided elevating him. Naming creates identity. Identity creates followers. Silence denies both. The Illuminati were treated not as a movement worth debate, but as a deviation to be corrected. This approach also protected the Church politically. If the crackdown succeeded, Rome appeared wise. If excess occurred, responsibility rested locally. Authority remained intact either way. This flexibility was deliberate, refined through centuries of managing dissent. The Church's power lay in alignment. When bishops, rulers, and universities shared assumptions, action required little coordination. Everyone already agreed what secrecy meant. Everyone already knew what reform without permission implied. For members of the Illuminati, this was disorienting. There was no opponent to confront, no statement to answer. Condemnation arrived through lost positions, withdrawn support, and moral suspicion. Guilt was assumed through category rather than proof. This is what the Vatican was in practice, not a single proclamation, but a system that shaped outcomes by defining legitimacy. It did not need to shout, it only needed to let others speak its language. Quiet condemnation was safer than loud decree. Loudness invites resistance. Quiet pressure dissolves opposition before it can organize. By the time the Illuminati realized the full weight of ecclesiastical opposition, their structure was already broken. In this sense, the Church did not destroy the order directly. It created the conditions in which destruction felt necessary, reasonable, and inevitable. Silence was not absence, it was strategy. And in that quiet, the fate of the Illuminati was sealed. Understanding this prevents oversimplification. The Vatican was not a villain issuing secret orders, nor a passive observer. It was an environment of expectations. Those expectations guided behavior without instruction. In Catholic lands, deviation corrected itself through shared belief, shared fear, and shared interest. The Illuminati collided with that environment and lost. Their end was not mysterious. It was structural, cultural, and predictable. Once silence replaced dialogue, and authority replaced inquiry. History records the result more clearly than any decree ever could. Its lessons remain quietly present today. After the Illuminati collapsed, something unexpected happened. Instead of fading quietly into history, the name began to grow. With no organization left to defend itself, critics found it useful. A dissolved society could not respond, clarify, or correct exaggeration. That made it perfect as a symbol of unseen danger. In the years following 1785, Europe entered a period of intense anxiety. Revolutions erupted, monarchies trembled, old social orders cracked under pressure. People searched for causes that felt controllable and intentional. Abstract forces like economic stress or social change felt unsatisfying. A hidden enemy felt easier to blame. Writers hostile to Enlightenment ideas began linking the Illuminati to events they had never influenced. Pamphlets claimed secret coordination. Sermons warned of long-buried networks still pulling strings. The absence of evidence did not matter. The absence of living members made contradiction impossible. The French Revolution accelerated this process. Fear swept across Europe as kings were overthrown and churches attacked. Conservative thinkers looked for a single source behind the chaos. The Illuminati fit perfectly. They were secretive. They were reform-minded. They were already condemned. Their short lifespan made them mysterious rather than mundane. Critics ignored timelines. The order had been dismantled years before the revolution, but logic mattered less than narrative. A dissolved group could be blamed for everything precisely because it no longer existed to prove otherwise. The Church benefited indirectly from this shift. Blaming secret societies redirected attention away from internal failures and broader social pressures. Disorder became the result of plots, not systemic problems. This reinforced obedience and fear of dissent. The state also benefited. Unrest could be framed as infiltration rather than dissatisfaction. Surveillance and repression gained moral justification. The idea of hidden enemies justified visible control. Over time, the Illuminati transformed from historical group into mythic placeholder. It no longer referred to Weishaupt's order specifically. It became a word that meant secret manipulators, enemies of faith, destroyers of order. Precision disappeared. Symbol remained. Ironically, suppression created the legend. Had the order faded quietly, it might have remained a footnote. Public crackdowns, document releases, and moral panic ensured its name survived far beyond its reality. By becoming a scapegoat, the Illuminati gained a kind of immortality, not as an organization, but as an idea used whenever fear needed a face. That transformation tells us more about society than about the order itself. In the final years of the 18th century, the Illuminati were no longer an organization, but they were becoming something far more powerful. They were becoming a story. Two writers played a decisive role in this transformation: Augustin Barruel and John Robison. Their works did not uncover new evidence. They connected fear to narrative and turned collapse into conspiracy. Barruel was a French Jesuit writing in exile after the French Revolution. Robison was a Scottish scientist and conservative thinker. Both were alarmed by the fall of monarchy, the attack on the church, and the speed of social change. They did not see revolution as the result of inequality or political failure. They saw it as design. In their books, published in the late 1790s, they argued that the French Revolution was not spontaneous. It was planned. According to them, philosophers, Freemasons, and the Bavarian Illuminati formed a hidden chain of influence stretching across Europe. Each link passed ideas, weakened faith, and prepared society for collapse. The Illuminati became the missing piece. They were secretive. They were real. They were already condemned. That made them perfect villains. Barruel and Robison claimed the order survived suppression and continued operating underground. No proof was required. Survival through secrecy explained absence. Their arguments ignored timelines. The Illuminati had been dismantled years before the revolution began, but logic mattered less than coherence. Their story made fear feel organized. Chaos became intentional. Disorder became betrayal. These books spread rapidly. They were translated, reprinted, and cited by clergy and conservatives across Europe and America. The idea of a grand conspiracy was easier to accept than the idea that systems had failed. The Church found these narratives useful. They framed revolution as moral decay rather than institutional rigidity. Faith was not outdated. It was attacked. Authority was not unjust. It was undermined. The state found them useful as well. Repression could be justified as defense. Surveillance could be framed as protection. The enemy was invisible, so vigilance had to be constant. Over time, Barruel and Robison's theories hardened into belief. The Illuminati were no longer studied as a historical group. They were invoked as explanation. Every upheaval could now be traced to secret hands. This is how myth outlives reality. The Illuminati survived not because they continued to act, but because others continued to need them. Barruel and Robison did not preserve history. They repurposed it. And in doing so, they ensured that a short-lived Bavarian society would echo far beyond its actual existence, long after the facts had faded. After suppression, the word Illuminati began drifting away from its origin. It no longer pointed to Adam Weishaupt or Bavaria. It became shorthand for fear. People used it to name forces they could not see, verify, or control, turning a specific history into a vague symbol that traveled freely globally. This shift happened gradually through the 19th century as political unrest spread. Whenever revolutions, financial crises, or social change appeared, commentators reached for hidden explanations. Illuminati became a label flexible enough to blame without evidence, proof, or direct knowledge of real organizations or intentions behind those imagined threats at all. The original Bavarian group had clear limits in time and scale. It operated briefly, mostly in German lands, and collapsed under state pressure. But the myth required no limits. It expanded easily across borders, centuries, and cultures, absorbing new fears as societies changed and reshaped meanings repeatedly without restraint whatsoever. Religious writers, political leaders, and later journalists all contributed to this detachment. Each group reused the word for its own purpose. The name became a container. Whatever threat felt dangerous could be placed inside it and made to seem intentional and coordinated by unseen hands, distant planners, shadowy minds everywhere. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Illuminati accusations followed new technologies and powers. Banks, newspapers, factories, and later media were blamed. The word adapted to modern anxiety, attaching itself to institutions that felt distant, complex, and unaccountable to ordinary people. During periods of rapid change, uncertainty, fear everywhere. None of this reflected the historical order that ended in 1785. The real Illuminati left documents, names, and timelines. The myth ignored those details. It preferred simplicity. A single hidden enemy was easier than many visible causes behind social unrest, economic pressure, political failure, human error, chance, reality. As the term spread, it lost accountability. No one had to prove membership or coordination. Saying Illuminati explained events without investigation. This looseness allowed fear to travel faster than facts, reinforcing suspicion while discouraging careful historical understanding among the public across generations, borders, media, cultures, languages, politics, beliefs, eras, endlessly. The detachment also protected power. When blame becomes abstract, responsibility disappears. Leaders could point to invisible manipulators instead of addressing injustice, inequality, or poor decisions. The myth absorbed anger while leaving systems largely unchanged and unchallenged by frightened populations, distracted publics, anxious citizens, confused observers, seeking answers, stability, control, certainty. By the 20th century, Illuminati meant whatever the speaker feared most. It no longer required history. It required emotion. The word floated freely, untethered from Bavaria, Weishaupt, or context, shaped entirely by cultural anxiety and imagination across societies, media, rumor, speculation, storytelling, politics, propaganda, folklore, myth-making, repetition, exaggeration, fear, projection. What began as a small Enlightenment society became a mirror for collective unease. The Illuminati survived by becoming undefined. When facts dissolved, the name endured. That transformation explains why the myth remains powerful long after the real organization vanished from history, memory, records, archives, scholarship, debate, context, time, truth itself. Silence often appears passive, but in matters of authority it can become decisive. When the Church chose not to issue a single final proclamation on the Illuminati, it left a vacuum that others rushed to fill. That absence of closure became more powerful than any formal judgment could have been. A clear verdict limits interpretation. It defines guilt, scope, and time. Silence does the opposite. It allows suspicion to stretch. Without a final word from Rome, writers and critics were free to imagine that something too dangerous to name had occurred. The lack of clarity suggested depth. For the Church, this silence was practical. Issuing a detailed statement would have required evidence, defense, and debate. Debate invites challenge. By remaining quiet, the Church preserved authority while avoiding engagement with Enlightenment ideas on their own terms. Local condemnations had already done the work. Bishops, courts, and rulers enforced order. From Rome's perspective, the problem was resolved. Speaking further risked reopening it. Yet, that quiet resolution had consequences. Later generations interpreted silence as secrecy. If there was no final word, Perhaps there was no permission to speak. Perhaps the truth was hidden. This logic fed speculation. Writers like Barruel and others projected intention onto the quiet. Silence became proof that something existed beyond public knowledge. The Church had judged, they claimed, but withheld the verdict. This dynamic repeated across time. Whenever archives remained closed or statements remained general, imagination filled the gap. Silence allowed the myth to breathe. The Illuminati benefited from this unintentionally. Their name survived because it was never fully sealed by authority. Silence also protected the Church from error. If later facts contradicted early claims, there was no statement to retract. Authority remained intact. In the end, silence functioned as the most flexible sentence. It condemned without specifics and allowed endless reinterpretation. That is why the myth grew. Where words end, projection begins. And in that quiet, history blurred into legend. For ordinary believers, this silence felt natural. The Church often speaks, rarely and carefully. Mystery is part of faith. But when silence surrounds power, it invites fear. People assume that if something is not explained, it must be dangerous or forbidden. Over time, this assumption hardened into belief. Political authorities also found silence useful. They could cite moral concern without evidence. They could act decisively without justification. Silence made authority efficient. As centuries passed, the lack of a definitive end allowed the Illuminati to be reborn repeatedly in rumor. Each generation reshaped the quiet into whatever threat felt current. Thus, silence did not close the story. It extended it indefinitely. It also ensured that history would never feel settled. Questions remained open. In that openness, silence continued to speak long after events ended, shaping suspicion, belief, and myth across generations without needing proof, documents, or authority to sustain its influence in the public imagination. This is why silence mattered. It allowed stories to grow unchecked and endlessly adaptable across centuries, without closure ever, or resolution, or certainty ever. The real story of the Bavarian Illuminati is smaller, quieter, and more human than the legend that followed. They were not ancient masters of the world, not immortal manipulators, not architects of endless chaos. They were a short-lived Enlightenment society, born in a specific place, under specific pressures, and ended by very ordinary forces of law, fear, and authority. Founded in the year 1776, the Illuminati existed for less than a decade. Their membership was limited. Their influence was uneven. Their goals were largely philosophical. They believed reason could improve society, and that unchecked power, especially when wrapped in superstition, harmed both truth and people. They operated secretly because secrecy was required for survival, not conquest. In Bavaria, open reform invited punishment. Quiet discussion felt safer. That decision shaped their fate. What protected them briefly also made them vulnerable to suspicion and repression. The state did not defeat them with armies. It used decrees, searches, publications, and pressure. The Church did not need a dramatic condemnation. Its existing stance on secrecy framed judgment automatically. Together, these forces dismantled the order completely by the year 1785. After that point, the Illuminati no longer existed as an organization. What existed instead was silence. That silence created space. Into that space rushed fear, imagination, and politics. Writers hostile to Enlightenment ideas filled the gap with stories of survival and hidden control. Revolutions and social change demanded explanation. A dissolved secret society became a convenient answer. The smaller the facts, the larger the myth grew. This is the crucial distinction. The historical Illuminati were real, brief, and defeated. The modern Illuminati is an idea shaped by centuries of anxiety about power, secrecy, and loss of control. One belongs to archives, the other belongs to imagination. Understanding this does not require trust in authority. It requires attention to evidence, timelines, and context. The order left documents. It left names. It left dates. None support the legend that followed. Yet the legend persists because it serves a purpose. It gives shape to fear. It simplifies complexity. It turns systems into villains and uncertainty into intention. The vacuum between fact and fear is where myths thrive. The Illuminati legend was born not from what the group did, but from what people needed them to be. In the end, the story beneath the legend is not about hidden rulers. It is about how societies respond to change. When truth feels unstable, myths step in. When silence replaces explanation, imagination takes over. The Bavarian Illuminati vanished long ago. The lesson they left behind remains. Where secrecy, authority, and fear intersect, stories grow, larger than reality. And if we want to understand power, the most important question is not who controls everything, but why we are so ready to believe someone does. That belief reveals more about us than about them. It always has, and it still does today. Quietly, persistently, endlessly, in every generation. Seeking meaning, seeking order, seeking control, in uncertainty and silence.